And in order to unpack it all further, we're now delighted to welcome here in studio Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and Mr. Daniel Pomerantz, CEO of Reality Check. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Well, let's begin once again by making a clear distinction. ICC, ICJ, the first, some teeth, the latter baby teeth, if any at all, because any enforcement power is at the UN Security Council, and we know how the UN Security Council works, this veto paralysis. Bottom line, not much of a potential impact on the ground, and yet I wouldn't say PR-wise, but in terms of the impact on the global sentiment, it's quite clear, Mr. Pomerantz.
I actually see it a little bit differently. I think the potential impact here is significant, and it's dangerous to assume otherwise.
Right.
First of all, the ICJ, they don't have to prove that Israel committed genocide. They just have to prove that there is a possibility that there is a legitimate case to be made. That's all they have to prove, and the standard of evidence to prove that is very low. And based on that, they can get a temporary emergency order for an immediate ceasefire. That leaves Hamas in control. It leaves the hostages in captivity, possibly for years, with Israel unable to return fire. Now, if Israel does return fire or doesn't adhere to the ruling of the court, that would be a violation of international law, even if it's morally wrong. Now, if Israel were to disregard the ruling, aside from the PR problem, there would likely be a resolution tabled at the Security Council, and it may get vetoed and it may not. The United States normally would veto something like that, but if we're talking about violating an actual court order, it might not get vetoed. And if it doesn't get vetoed, the economic sanctions would be utterly destructive. It would cut off Israel entirely from the whole world. And even beyond that, individual nations like Norway, for example, have already brought criminal cases against Israeli officials. We would likely see arrest warrants from multiple countries around the world that would be enforced by Interpol. Israeli officials, even as former Israeli soldiers leaving the country, would be subject to arrest, conviction, and prison time.
Ambassador Ettinger, can you appease this Armageddon-ish, I can't believe I'm using this term for the second time on this broadcast, a scenario here?
The last thing that Israel should contemplate is to sacrifice its national security on the altar of any international organization, let alone this international court. We know exactly who are the members of the court. The world knows that. But most importantly, I cannot see the U.S. not vetoing a negative decision by the courts at the Security Council, because a decision by the courts which would tie the hands of the U.S. would play into the hands of Islamic terrorists who consider the U.S. more than Israel as their prime target. Islamic terrorist organizations who are after the regimes in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the Emirates and any other pro-American Arab country. In addition, the only element in the U.S. which would tolerate condemnation of Israel by the court would be the very radical wing of the Democratic Party, which is a minority within the Democratic Party. And last and not least, realistic Americans know that this is not Israel's battle alone against this fake international court. It's an American battle. We are serving American interests by opposing it.
I should say I absolutely agree with Ambassador Ettinger that Israel should not sacrifice its security issues on the basis of some international body. However, Israel does have to understand we're fighting a war on two fronts, and one of those fronts is communication and law, and if we neglect those fronts, we will pay a price for it just as much as if we were to neglect a military front. The case against Israel for genocide is absurd, just as Secretary Blinken said. But the problem is South Africa is not bringing this case to win it. They're just bringing the case to interfere with Israel's ability to defend itself using legal technicalities. It's cynical, and it harms the cause of preventing genocide throughout the world.
Yeah, to mere force Israel to address those claims, not
just to force Israel to address the claims, but to force Israel to deal with a temporary restraining order to prevent the successful completion of this self-defense.
Irony committing murder-suicide here, South Africa charging Israel for genocide. Ambassador Ettinger, worst case scenario and best case scenario?
Well, there's only one scenario. Does Israel want to restore its posture of deterrence, which was demolished, literally demolished on October 7th? Since then, we have resurged very, very effectively, and we don't want to lose that restoration of posture of deterrence. The International Court aims at further eroding Israel's posture of deterrence. Israel has to make it very clear that we do not intend to subordinate ourselves to any decision by the International Court. Defiance would provide more posture of deterrence. Compliance with the court would further deteriorate our posture of deterrence.
What Israel should do is go to the court and win, and then bring actions against Hamas, and bring actions against the Palestinian Authority, and bring actions against South Africa. That would create some real deterrence.
So at this point, Israel is on the defensive side of this battle. How can it move to the offensive part of it?
Well, the legal team has been very closed about what they intend to do in terms of the media, but based on my experience in situations like this, it's critical to take a good offense, and that means counterclaims. You don't just go in there and defend yourself, which Israel absolutely can do, because Israel has been extraordinarily cautious about civilian casualties, and that's the truth.
Yes.
But Israel can also bring counterclaims against the other parties, which include parties that have openly stated that they intend to carry out acts of genocide.
Ambassador Ettinger, in the short time we have left, your take, sir, on not the what, but the how of Blinken's visit here. The music, if you will, sometimes is not less important than the lyrics in diplomacy.
Well, the music has been known from the first day he stepped into his role as Secretary of State, namely being completely out of touch with Middle East reality. We should not ignore the fact that side by side with very, very highly appreciated assistance to Israel's war effort, it was Blinken who lifted sanctions off the Ayatollahs of Iran, which provided them since February 2021 some $100 billion extra income.
Some of what we're seeing now.
Well, much.
Ambassador Ettinger, Mr. Pomerantz, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. This is it from us for now. We will be back at the top of the hour.